They were meeting regularly with the government agents the president had sent to Chicago. Out in the open, Elliot Ness and his untouchables were building a prohibition violation case, while the intelligence agents worked undercover, risking their lives for evidence of something that at face value seemed almost comical: income tax evasion.
Some people may think it's comical that Al Capone was brought down on tax evasion, but it just shows you how difficult it was to get Al Capone on other crimes. Witnesses typically ended up dead.
And there was another problem. The people of Chicago liked their liquor. Capone was their supplier. They weren't eager to see him put away.
If the feds go after Capone on prohibition charges, this case is going to be tried in two places. It's going to be tried in federal court, but it's also going to be tried in the court of public opinion. Income tax was a good way to go, on the other hand, because the average taxpayer could relate to the wrongness of a citizen dodging responsibility to contribute to the general good of society.
The 6 Internal Revenue Intelligence agents assigned to the Capone case met in a small room in the old Chicago Post Office building. They were no ordinary men.
They have to be the kind of person that has the courage to go through a door, knowing that there may be people armed on the other side, and yet have the ability to trace the smallest bits of evidence. Not everyone could do books and records. Not everyone could go through a door. Special agents, to be effective of IRS intelligence or criminal investigation, have to be able to do both.
The agents worked the streets. Slowly, the road to Capone opened up. One agent found a prostitute working at a Capone brothel who agreed to be his informant. Frank Wilson, the head of the investigation, had another, a man who owned a racetrack with Capone. His name was Eddie O'Hare. Risking his own life, O'Hare played both sides of the fence.
Eddie O'Hare had been working in Chicago with the Capone mob for years, and then for reasons of his own, partly I think to cleanse his reputation, and partly because he had this idea that he wanted his son to go to the Naval Academy at Annapolis, and they certainly weren't going to let an associate of organized crime send his son there. He contacted the IRS and started cooperating with them as a confidential informant during the income tax evasion case, providing them with various types of information, some of which seems to have been, somewhat crucial.
Agent Mike Malone took the riskiest job, sure death if he was caught. He checked into the Lexington Hotel, home of Capone's headquarters, and with money from the Secret Six, started making friends with the Capone gang. One night, the gang invited Malone to one of Al's parties. Malone was worried. He'd heard what Capone had done to traitors at one of his so-called parties. What if he'd found out who Malone was? He decided to hide an extra gun in his belt, just in case.
Salute to Chicago. Hey, Mike. Nice to see you too.
When dinner was served, Malone took a bite of steak. He'd never had spiced steak before. It didn't go down easy.
And his gun supposedly popped out of his belt where he had a holster. Luckily, no one saw it. It ended up in his lap. And he was able to put it back in time before anyone spotted that he had a gun.
Days later, when Capone walked out of a theater and ran into 2 policemen, he had a lot on his mind. The New York mob was unhappy with him. He'd drawn attention to the mob with his love of publicity. His killing sprees had gotten out of hand. They'd given him a warning. Shaken, Capone had arranged to have himself arrested for carrying a concealed weapon to get off the streets. In March 1930, while he was in jail, the Internal Revenue Intelligence agents made their first crack into the Capone empire. Capone's lieutenant, Frank Nitti, was found guilty of income tax evasion and sent to prison for a year and a half. A month later, another crack. Capone's other lieutenant, Jake Guzik, was convicted of income tax evasion and sent away for 5 years. A month after that, it was Al's brother, Ralph. He'd be gone 3 years. Capone's base was beginning to crumble, but the boss was going to be more difficult to bring down. He had a fail-safe way to protect himself. His real name was never used in payments or ledgers. He didn't have a bank account. There was no source to tie him to an income. Capone's public face was confident.
I think he would have been blind if he wouldn't have seen that this is what they're doing, this is how they do this, and they are getting convictions. This is not something that is just going to pass away, where they're going to take this case to court and the jury is going to turn its back on it and return a verdict of not guilty.
He may have looked confident, but Capone had to be feeling the pressure. He'd underestimated the Internal Revenue agents. Now his most trusted allies and his brother were gone. They were closing in. In March 1930, the Secret Six made its next move to turn up the heat on Capone.
One of the members of the Secret Six was Frank Lesh. He was involved in the Secret Six, and he was also the head of the Chicago Crime Commission.
The Chicago Crime Commission, a private watchdog group, published a public enemy list with the names of the 28 worst criminals in Chicago. Capone would earn the spot of public enemy #1 several times over the next year. A gangster who craved legitimacy had now been publicly named the most dangerous person in Chicago.
It's kind of a complex thing to be a gangster, I think, in terms of personality. On the one hand, you're involved in these illegal activities, you're breaking the law left and right, you're involved in violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, for their own self-esteem, they probably would like people to like them and would like to be respected in some sense. Nobody would like their children to think of them or know them as a gangster. They would probably like to be thought of as something else, someone who actually did good in some fashion or another.
The Secret Six was becoming famous for its crime fighting. It opened a speakeasy to buy leads from small-time hoods, hired its own investigators, and continued to finance the work being done by the Untouchables and the Internal Revenue agents. Their fame was spreading across the country. Groups of businessmen in St. Louis and Kansas City were starting their own crime-fighting organizations modeled after the Six. Everyone wanted to know who the Secret Six were. Capone read the newspapers, and they were beginning to make him uneasy. He asked for a meeting with the head of the Secret Six, Robert Isham Randolph. In his memoirs, Randolph wrote that Capone offered him a deal. If the Secret Six would stop gunning for him, he'd police Chicago for them. Randolph refused. It was a bad time for Capone all around. The world of the rackets was changing for him. There was a new mayor in Chicago with a new law enforcement department that couldn't be paid off. His violent way of doing business was becoming obsolete, even for gangsters. And now he was threatened with doing some real prison time. Capone was running out of options. He called his lawyer and arranged another meeting, this time with the head of the Internal Revenue Intelligence Unit, Frank Wilson.
Mr. Capone is willing to make amends with the government.
Capone was looking for a deal.
He was willing to pay the government, the Internal Revenue Service, about $1.5 million if they would just walk away and not prosecute him criminally.
But Wilson wasn't interested. On his way out of the office, Capone stopped and whispered into the agent's ear. "How's your wife, Wilson? You take care of yourself." Wilson took the threat to heart. He knew what Capone was capable of. But the way he saw it, the Internal Revenue agents didn't need to make a deal with Capone. There was a smoking gun called the Hawthorne Smoke Shop, and they were about to discover it. Mike Malone would hear about it first, one night while he was having drinks with one of the Capone guys. Those income tax dicks aren't so bright, the gangster said. He told Malone about an accounting ledger the police had taken in a raid on a Capone gambling house called the Hawthorne Smoke Shop. It's there somewhere, the gangster said, right under their noses. It's all the evidence they'd ever need to get Capone.
Right under their noses.
Frank Wilson would be the one to find the hard evidence. He was just finishing an 18-hour day, looking through ledgers from police raids, hoping to find one with Capone's name in it. He'd decided to call it a night. And then he found something he had not seen before. It was a ledger for a gambling house that operated under the cover of the Hawthorne Smoke Shop. On one of the pages, he found the name Al, and across from it the amount, $17,500.
The Hawthorne ledger was crucial to the case because here we had direct evidence that Al Capone was receiving money. Jurors understand when they see sheets of paper and someone explains it, that here's a bottom line number and this person got the number and it's not on any tax return.
Now Wilson had to connect Capone to the Al in the ledger. He had a couple of ideas. He'd had his intelligence agents collect handwriting samples from police records and voter registrations of more than 1,000 of Chicago's gangsters. Now he compared them to the handwriting in the ledger and found a match. The cashier's name was Leslie Shumway. He called his informant Eddie O'Hare to see if O'Hare knew where Shumway was.
Eddie, you know Leslie Shumway?
If they could find the cashier, they had Capone. They tracked Shumway down to a racetrack in Florida and found another Capone cashier, Fred Reese. Now they had two witnesses who could testify against Capone. But there was a problem. There was no federal witness protection program. How would they keep them alive?
So the Secret Six sort of said, well, you know, we're going to do what we have to do here. And they bankrolled that activity. And that was, in a sense, their own private little army, fighting the racketeers in the way that the racketeers themselves fought.
As the intelligence agents were building their case against Capone, a letter came into Wilson's office from Capone's tax lawyer, Lawrence Mattingly. It laid out a statement of Capone's estimated earnings for the previous 5 years. Capone, who was worth more than $25 million, was ready to own up to making $226,000 over 4 years. Why would Capone's own lawyer send the investigators incriminating evidence against his client?
The purpose and the intent of that letter was that Mattingly and Capone were trying to settle the tax problems of Capone out of court. They were trying to reach a civil settlement. You know, and many taxpayers today reach civil settlements every day with the IRS.
The intelligence unit, the intelligence division, after that, and the criminal investigation division now, doesn't accept money in lieu of prosecution. Otherwise, everyone who would get caught would just simply say, okay, I'll pay now what I was supposed to pay in the first place.
The case against Al Capone was mounting. Desperate, his lawyer made another call, this time to the U.S. attorney. Capone was ready to cut a deal.
And in fact, they did cut a deal. And the deal was Capone would plead guilty. He would do 2.5 years in prison, so it would be a much lighter sentence. A plea bargain was a way of demonstrating to the public that Capone was not invincible and that Capone was going to be imprisoned.
There was just one problem. The people who'd put the plan to get Capone together 3 years earlier, the government, the Secret Six, the agents, had gone to a lot of trouble to get him. Were they really going to let him off with a sentence of 2.5 to 5 years? When Capone's lawyer stood before the judge to get a ruling on the plea bargain, the judge did something unusual.
Judge James Wilkerson looked at that proposed plea bargain and rejected it. He nixed